Hi, good afternoon. I'm Wing Kin, the Associate Dean of Partnerships and Analytics from OER. I bid a warm welcome to one and all, and especially we thank our keynote speakers, Associate Professor Mark Baildon, and also Dr. Dennis Quek, for giving their time to enlighten us on this very interesting theme, which is on inquiry-based learning in Singapore classrooms. Now, the OER-AST research webinar reinforces the collaboration between researchers and also practitioners in our Singapore education system. Today, the theme, inquiry-based learning in Singapore classrooms. This is very close to the hearts of practitioners as well as researchers. Inquiry-based learning, IBL for short, has been used widely in curriculum and instruction. Yet, it has proven to be challenging to implement effectively. This webinar will share some of the challenges enacting IBL found in Singapore classrooms and offer research-based findings on pedagogies and classroom practices that promote IBL. Our first speaker is Associate Professor Mark Baildon. He's an Associate Professor at the Humanities and Social Studies Education Academic Group, NIE. He has taught secondary social studies at the United States, Israel, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and Taiwan. His research focuses on issues-based and inquiry-based teaching and learning, global citizenship education, and the 21st century critical literacies. He has published 3 books: Social Studies as New Literacies in Global Society in 2011, Controversial History as New Literacies in the Global Society, in Asian Context, 2013, and his latest book with Tracy Alvia Martin is Research on Global Citizenship Education in Asia, Conceptions, Perceptions, and Practices in 2021. The title of this talk is Research Findings on Inquiry in Classroom, Implications for Teaching and Learning. In this talk, we expect that there are findings from studies in Singapore as well as international literature to highlight effective inquiry-based pedagogies and teacher beliefs that support IBL. The sharing will focus on research evidence that highlights the ways teachers can create inquiry-based classroom cultures, help students make connections between their prior knowledge and experiences to curriculum topics, support IBL through a range of questioning strategies, and effectively scaffolding IBL. Let us now warmly welcome our first keynote speaker, Associate Professor Mark Baildon.
Thank you, Wang Kin, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for this opportunity to share research findings on inquiry in classrooms and implications for teaching and learning. I would like to just share that the basis for the presentation is really drawn from 3 different articles that you'll be able to access, and I'll put these up at the end of the presentation as well. The first one was a group of us that did a synthesis of about 24 research studies in Singapore classrooms that looked at inquiry-based pedagogies and inquiry-based learning. And so this is where most of the presentation will focus, is some of the findings that were derived from this synthesis report. I've also been involved in a meta-synthesis on inquiry-based classroom practices that looked at humanities and the arts, both international literature as well as Singapore studies. And then the last one is a publication that was first published in NIE Perspectives, which is for our pre-service teachers, but you can access this. They very kindly allowed this to be published on HSSE online. And so you can take a look at that as well. There's also going to be Singapore teaching practice chapter that I've written that should be available soon. I think it's being reviewed and vetted by AST, so you'll be able to have access to that as well. And it really tries to summarize some of the findings in terms of the literature. So the overview for the presentation today is I'll just share very briefly a case for inquiry-based learning. I think we're all fairly committed to it. It's been part of our curriculum across subjects for a few years now, but I'll just briefly touch on that and then talk about creating an inquiry culture in classrooms, look at effective IBL practices. Again, these are pretty much drawn across the different subject matters as well as in primary and secondary classrooms. Speak a little bit about teaching with and for inquiry, and then conclude with some implications regarding an inquiry-based ethos, stance, and teaching practice. So that's the agenda. And I wanted to start with just talking about the case for inquiry-based learning. And I think, as all of us are aware, we're undergoing some fairly profound shifts in terms of the nature of work. And so one of those is that we see some forces of changes such as technology that is really disrupting workplaces and disrupting society in particular ways. And so we're seeing work and workforces being redefined. And it's really about sort of transforming the workplace and really calls upon individuals, organizations, and public policy to think more about the kinds of skills that are necessary in this moment of transition. So we're really moving away from the kinds of jobs where people were expected to follow directions, and some of these jobs were fairly routine in some ways. Those are being replaced by automation, and now we're moving into types of work that require much more critical and creative thinking. And so the World Economic Forum has identified the top 10 skills that are necessary in this new global knowledge economy. And so you see those organized according to 4 types of skills. One is problem solving. Another is self-management. It requires workers to be much more self-directed, to take initiative, to have greater autonomy in terms of decision-making and the kinds of work that they do. But certainly collaborative skills in terms of working with people are very important. And then being able to use and develop technology. My area of focus has been on citizenship. And so I'm very interested in civic dispositions and skills. And so here you see some of the things that I've outlined that I think are really important in terms of some of the grand challenges that we face in the 21st century. So thinking about climate change, grand challenges like pandemic and health-related issues. I think, human rights violations, extremism, these kinds of things are grand challenges that really societies are facing. And those call upon us, I think, as citizens to be concerned about justice, to have some level of ecological literacy, because these are really, many of these issues are socio-scientific. And so they're really much more interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary in nature. And so thinking about different perspectives, thinking about what it means to be able to bring about change that really addresses some of these kinds of problems, I think is going to be more and more important. And so we see inquiry really as a method of intelligence. So Dewey talked about inquiry as a method of intelligence that's really necessary to deal with much more complex, unstructured problems and to develop lifelong learning capacities that help all of us become better people, able to benefit others and benefit society. So again, when we look across this landscape of change and some of the grand challenges that we're facing, inquiry really provides sort of the means and the methods for lifelong learning to keep pace with some of these changes and to be able to have greater agency in terms of some of these changes. When we look at the international literature, Lazander and Harmson did a meta-analysis of 72 studies, and they found inquiry-based learning to be more effective than other more teacher-centered pedagogical approaches. And by more effective, we mean that they were more effective in terms of student learning outcomes. And so this was across all age groups. There we go. But there's some caveats with this, and some of the literature points to there's some necessary conditions for inquiry-based learning to be more effective. One is that students really have to be supported adequately with very specific targeted guidance and scaffolding. So inquiry really only works if students are guided and scaffolded throughout the inquiry process. So that's an important aspect of this that was found in these studies that they analyzed. We also see some work that focuses around the importance of teachers' beliefs. So teacher beliefs matter, and those beliefs, I think the scholars doing this study looked at this notion of beliefs being more of a sort of interconnected web of beliefs that are necessary for inquiry-based practitioners. So it's having more of a constructivist view of knowledge. It's seeing all students as very capable of learning through IBL. There's also particular pedagogical orientations and really a sense of efficacy on the part of teachers to manage challenges. And there are many, I think, that we find in the international literature as well as in Singapore. I'm going to be touching upon each of these in more detail as we go through the presentation. But also pedagogical expertise matters. And there's two conditions in particular that seem to result in effective IBL. And one is that teachers are able to align the curriculum aims, lesson design, and pedagogical approaches. And so, I think in Singapore, we certainly have inquiry-based curriculum. And so really the ways that teachers design lessons and then implement those lessons, as well as some of the pedagogical approaches they use in the classroom, are really of great importance. And so this partly means enacting teaching as facilitating, coaching, scaffolding, mentoring, and questioning. And so really thinking about a very different role for teachers in terms of sort of guiding students through the inquiry process. And again, these findings, these international findings, are consistent with the findings that we have in Singapore, which I'll share. So if we talk about creating a inquiry-based learning culture in classrooms, there's some key conditions that are important. First of all, they're characterized as cultures of trust, purpose, and belonging. They're inclusive. Students feel like they belong. Their voice matters. It's a culture of questioning. We also see that there are particular kinds of routines and scaffolds that support students doing inquiry. And this is around the design of authentic intellectual tasks, that students see that there's purpose and meaning in the work that they're doing in the classroom. It's not just schoolwork. It actually has value outside of the classroom. It's addressing real problems, authentic intellectual problems. And we also see that there are routines in which there's scaffolding and guidance for students. They provide tremendous support to help students manage some of the challenges of inquiry-based learning. And again, this comes back to a very, I think, strong sense of purpose on the part of the teacher, that this is clearly communicated. There's strong justification that's provided for inquiry-based learning, that's communicated to students, parents, administrators, colleagues. And so there's a strong commitment to this and to caring and supportive relationships as well. So Kath Murdoch is someone who, this book is actually an excellent book, I think, for all teachers that are interested in inquiry. I think that it'd be an excellent focus for a professional learning community. It's quite accessible, but she's identified what IBL classrooms look like, sound like, and feel like. So if you walked into an inquiry-based classroom, these are some of the things that you'd see. You'd see that students do have some choice in terms of some of the topics they're investigating. It's a flexible classroom. It tends to be more open, and there's kind of a give and take or a to and fro between teachers and students. Students are supported to figure things out for themselves. They're encouraged and also supported in doing that. There's a lot of questions, and that's one of the themes that I'll keep coming back to, that these are cultures in which teachers are using questioning strategically, but also we see a lot of student questions as well. So there's a lot of exchange of questions, students wondering about things, asking questions, and the teacher responding, being very responsive to those questions. So student curiosity is stimulated. Again, there's a sense of authenticity that the learning and the work that students are doing are authentic, and there's linkages to more authentic, maybe social contexts, or the work that scientists do in laboratories, those kinds of things, authentic problems. And there's limited whole class instruction and teacher talk, that we see students having kind of the center stage in these classrooms. And I think the last condition is very important, that we also see teachers that are inquirers themselves, and they're inquiring into their students. They're asking students about their interests, about their experiences. They're also inquiring into content and pedagogy. This is from a study that my wife and I did on her own teaching in her classroom, and really focusing on this idea of a culture of questioning is where students are enculturated or socialized into a culture in which they're learning to ask and answer a series of systematic questions, especially about information. Is this something I can trust? How do I make sense of this? They're doing that sort of, they have guiding questions that help them in doing the analytical and interpretive work that they do, as they're working on problems. And this mirrors what we see happening in disciplinary communities. There's a set of criteria and guiding questions that help people that work in these communities to really monitor and self-correct their own efforts. So there's a meta level, kind of a metacognition aspect of this. I think Dennis will talk more about this in terms of some of the core findings, but that sort of metacognition is a key aspect of this. One thing that we found in the study of these, or in the synthesis of these 24 or so studies that we looked at, is that belief is really an important kind of foundation for being able to enact inquiry-based pedagogies. And so this foundation of teacher beliefs and dispositions included a belief in the power of inquiry as well as the purposes of IBL. So again, it's that commitment to inquiry, that this is important for students, it's important for society. So there's a belief that inquiry is the way that students best learn and construct knowledge. There's also a belief that all students are capable of and benefit from IBL. So they see students as, with the proper scaffolding, is that they can learn a great deal through the inquiry process. They construct knowledge through that process. And so there's a commitment to all students learning. There's also, I think, a belief on the part of teachers in their own efficacy to manage challenges. And I'm not going to talk so much about the challenges that we found in these studies. They were identified, but they tend to be, I think, the kinds of challenges that you're familiar with. And that's, a challenge of time. The idea that there's kind of a pressure to cover curriculum in a limited amount of time, and that inquiry takes more time in terms of classroom discussions and the kinds of work that students are doing. And then there's some of the pressures of preparing students for exams too. But teachers in these studies, have a belief in their ability to really manage some of these challenges, and they see professional development opportunities and professional inquiry and collaboration with colleagues as a way to manage some of those challenges. There's also kind of an open-mindedness, kind of a growth mindset. I think, again, this sort of inquiry mindset that teachers have, in which they are working with colleagues to try to, explore new pedagogical practices. They're much more self-directed in terms of really, being willing to try things. It's kind of this idea of teachers as curriculum gatekeepers who are making decisions and kind of directing the kind of classrooms that they desire, that they believe best benefit students. So if we look at the practices of effective inquiry-based learning, again, this is in terms of pedagogies that enhance or improve student learning outcomes. We see 5 key dimensions of effective inquiry-based learning. The first one, and I'll speak to each one of these, but they're all actually quite interrelated. The first one is the effective use of questioning. So we see, again, teachers and students engaged in a sort of a culture of questioning, and teachers are using questioning strategically. There's also a great deal of scaffolding that we see. So teachers who effectively use IBL are not only scaffolding kind of the intellectual skills or the cognitive skills of students, but they're also scaffolding students in terms of emotion. So they're encouraging, they're helping students develop kind of the confidence that they need to be able to figure things out for themselves. A great deal of emphasis on student-centered learning. So again, the students are in the center. And we also found that teachers that are doing this work are also engaging in helping students think about different perspectives. And there's an emphasis on synthesizing information or consolidating knowledge in the lessons that were observed. And then the last part is that there's clear linkage here between what students are doing in classrooms and disciplined inquiry, whether it's in science, in terms of some of the kinds of reasoning that scientists do, or whether it's in the humanities, focused on geographical reasoning. We see that these teachers are paying attention to these practices, social practices of disciplined inquiry. So if we break these down a little bit, one thing that we found is that teachers use a range of questioning approaches and strategies. I think the work of Carolyn Ho and Tricia Siao, Carolyn from Ellis and Tricia from NIE, they've been using this notion of talk moves in geography classrooms that really, I think, focus on these kinds of focus on
dendrobium ambulatum
okay. So focusing on these kinds of questions that can really probe student thinking or ask students to clarify their thinking. And the second point of that is that they also really get students to think about the kinds of claims and evidence and sort of reasoning that either they're engaging with or that they're expected to communicate in their learning. The scaffolding, like I said, focuses on students' emotional needs, especially in terms of working through ambiguity or challenge in working on problems, helping students manage, the fear maybe of making mistakes, and kind of overcoming that fear of trying things out. So it provides a safe space for students to share their views and their work. We also noticed that there are learning consolidations, especially at the end of lessons, where there's a recap, there's a review of the learning, or maybe key ideas and concepts. And so it's the teacher kind of pulling things together with the students to really think about the learning that's gone on during that particular lesson. But we also see other kinds of scaffolding in terms of guiding students to work with authentic data or information sources. And again, we see a range of scaffolds, whether they're mind maps or different kinds of templates or even verbal scaffolding. There's a range of scaffolding heuristics, it's guiding questions. But we see, teachers, again, strategically guiding students through the use of scaffolding. And then we also have a lot of cases of, teachers using ICT-enabled forms of scaffolding. And I think a couple of the breakout sessions will be focusing on that as well in terms of collaborative argumentation. Wenli will share some of the work that they've done using an ICT-enabled form of scaffolding to help students really organize their ideas and structure their arguments. The emphasis on student learning, one thing that we found is that there's special attention really given to students' prior ideas and experiences. And this is done for a couple of reasons. One is to identify any misconceptions that need to be addressed, but it's also, using or building on students' ideas as well. So there's this notion of leveraging their ideas, maybe connecting to their personal experiences, and maybe using analogies to help them understand concepts. So they really, I think it's a pedagogy of connection. It's sort of making connection between content and students' experiences and students' ideas. So making sure that content is accessible in terms of students' experiences is an important first move there. But we also see that they're encouraging students to experiment and to explore, and again, to think. And they do that through the design of rich tasks, very meaningful, authentic tasks for inquiry. So rich problems, for example, that students are investigating, and really kind of scaffolding student interest in some ways. And so there's a focus again on tasks that require student engagement in terms of maybe cooperative learning or collaborative learning or field work, or working in a laboratory, rather than on teacher talk. The perspective taking and synthesizing of information is also an essential part. Whoops, that's my timer to tell me that I've hit the 20-minute mark, so I'll wrap things up. But really encouraging and guiding students to consolidate or synthesize their learning, and encouraging students to view issues, problems, and tasks from multiple perspectives. And so we see using a lot of other sources, bringing in different perspectives other than those provided by the textbook. And so sometimes it's different kinds of data sources, bringing in different sorts of debates that there might be around a particular topic or issue, and so on. And again, this synthesis looks at classroom. Okay, so engage students in core social practices of disciplined inquiry. I've mentioned that. So it's really helping students understand the nature of the discipline and how knowledge is constructed. So again, there's sort of that meta level view, so that it's helping students understand that these inquiry practices actually promote the building of knowledge in the disciplines. And there's a tremendous focus on evidence-based reasoning. So it's really work around both the evaluation of claims and evidence, but it's also having students develop their own claims, their own arguments that are well supported with evidence and reasons. And they make explicit these practices. They talk about these practices and the kinds of thinking, and they provide guiding heuristics that really can guide students in terms of the reasoning that they're expecting students to do. But they also model this thinking. They provide models in terms of maybe think alouds, in terms of kind of taking students through a particular kind of problem and reasoning through it. And so just to start to move towards concluding here, if we think about teaching with inquiry, we're really thinking about using inquiry as a means to learn content. So inquiry-based learning is constructivism, pure and simple. It's a way that students can develop the kind of lifelong learning skills that they'll need to learn new content, but inquiry becomes the means to learn content because it enables students to construct their own knowledge. It's also the idea of teaching for inquiry as a way of thinking. And so I've mentioned this, that inquiry itself is an end of teaching and learning, because we want students to have more disciplined ways of thinking about problems, thinking about information, thinking about the different kinds of texts that they might engage with. And so again, we come back to this notion of inquiry as a method of intelligence from Dewey. And so if just to conclude, one of the things that I'd like to highlight is sort of this paradox of inquiry. When we talk about inquiry, we're talking about an inquiry method, but it's not just a matter of technique and strategy. And I think one of the things that's important is really thinking about the kind of culture that we're creating in classrooms, and even within the broader school context. It's more of an ethos in that sense. And it's an ethos of questioning, reflection, collaboration. And it's a questioning of, really figuring things out for ourselves. It's moving away from, this notion of just tell me what to do, teacher, just tell me what to do on this, or even teachers just, sometimes I hear this, even at NIE, just tell me what to do. And it's really not about that. It's about figuring things out for ourselves and kind of working together collaboratively to do that. But it also requires an inquiry stance. So this notion of a set of commitments or a position in the classroom that the teacher takes. And it's a stance towards questioning and seeing questions is kind of core to what you're doing. It's a stance towards knowledge. It's more of a constructivist stance. It's a stance towards oneself as an inquirer and being curious and wanting to learn more about students and so on. And it's really about how you see and view your students as well. And then the last thing is that, thinking about inquiry as participation in social practices. And so one of the things that we're doing when students walk into that classroom is socializing them into particular ways of thinking and doing that we hope that they'll be able to be able to apply outside of the classroom and transfer to, to other situations and problems. And the last is that even though these social practices are shaped by cultural factors, we do have agency to change those, including in our own classroom. I wanted to just share an article, it's in the references at the end of the slides, that Peidong Yang has recently published that looks at teacher agency and inquiry practices, specifically social studies issues investigation. Anyways, I'll end there. And again, I'll make the slides available so that if you want to dig a little bit more deeply into some of this, you can take a look at these articles. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing.